The soldier had just set foot at the gate of his old house when he heard a soft voice calling from the direction of the dog kennel. When he opened the gate, he froze. His daughter was curled up inside with the dog, clutching a crumpled scrap of paper with a Bible verse written on it. Why would a child be locked up like a pet in her own home, and that father? What did he do to reclaim justice? Michael Reese stood motionless. His uniform was crisp but worn at the elbows and collar. His hands slid down the straps of his old backpack as if retracing the places he'd been. The zipper was rusted, but he had never replaced it. It was the only thing left that still made that familiar metal click when he opened it. No one came to the door. He didn't ring the bell again, just stepped aside to make way for a few guests walking through the side gate where string lights blinked around a rose bush signaling a party not meant for someone arriving late. A boy of about 8 darted across the yard holding a toy car made from a soda can. When his eyes met Michael's, the boy paused. He furrowed his brow, not because he recognized him, but because he couldn't place which part of the house this stranger belonged to. Michael offered a small smile. The boy didn't respond. He tilted his head like a cautious bird, then turned and ran off. His shoes let out a faint squeal on the polished tiles, leaving behind a stretched silence, and Michael's searching gaze still hoping for some kind of confirmation, or at least a child's voice calling his name. A woman's voice floated from somewhere inside the house. "Sarah, I think someone's at the gate." The click-clack of heels drew closer. Then the front door swung open. A young woman stood there with dark red lipstick and heavily lined eyes. She wasn't Sarah. "Excuse me, you are..." "I'm Emily's father." She flinched slightly, then awkwardly adjusted the hem of her dress. "Sarah's in the kitchen. We're having a small get-together tonight." "Come in, I'll let her know you're here." Michael stepped into the foyer. The scent of perfume mixed with grilled meat and sweet pastries, giving the air an oddly impersonal feel. Quietly, he set his backpack near the wooden cabinet and looked around. He didn't recognize a single face. Soft classical music drifted in from the living room. A man in a white dress shirt holding a glass of wine approached. "Lucky you showed up on party night. Is this a return for good or just passing through again?" Michael didn't extend his hand. He just nodded slightly, a mechanical gesture. His eyes stayed fixed on the doorway that led to the backyard, the same spot where he used to spend long afternoons with Emily, breathing in the scent of damp earth, the wind and the echoes of her laughter. Now the house was crowded, buzzing with unfamiliar chatter. Not one person had mentioned his daughter's name. The clinking of glasses, the occasional giggle, the soft click of heels on the tile floor. All of it floated through a world where Emily didn't seem to exist. There were no traces of the little girl who used to scatter crayons across the dining table or mimic cat sounds just to make Michael laugh in the mornings. Everything was neat, spotless, emotionless, and he, in what was once his own home, suddenly felt like an uninvited guest shut out of the life born from his own blood. "She's probably asleep," said the woman from earlier, turning back with a tight smile. "She's been a bit difficult lately. Sometimes kids need to learn not to be spoiled." Michael didn't answer. He didn't sigh. He simply walked past her as if her words were a layer of dust he needed to brush aside to get to the truth. As he passed the living room, he spotted a tall, slender woman carrying a tray of pastries, her back turned. The movement was familiar, yet distant. Sarah hadn't changed. She never turned around unless she absolutely had to. He stopped long enough for an older woman nearby to whisper to her companion, "Isn't that Sarah's husband?" No one replied. But in that silence, Michael understood something clearly. Everyone knew who he was. They were just pretending not to see him. A tall man stepped out of the kitchen shirt, untucked a pair of sunglasses resting on his head. He saw Michael, paused for a moment, then forced a smile. "Michael, what a surprise. I thought you were still stationed at Fort Oak Ridge." Sarah didn't mention anything. Michael said nothing. That man was Trevor Monroe, Sarah's cousin, once described as a temporary house guest. Now he carried himself like the man of the house. "Emily doing okay?" Michael asked, still not meeting his eyes. Trevor hesitated. "She's probably asleep. She's been sensitive since you left." A middle-aged woman chimed in. "I heard the girl moved in with her grandmother somewhere near Clearwater. Or maybe I got that wrong." Michael stayed silent. He took a few more steps, his eyes scanning the room. Embroidered tablecloths, fresh roses in a vase, sparkling crystal glasses. Everything looked new, unfamiliar. Nothing remained from the house he had left almost a year ago. Sarah appeared behind the kitchen counter, placing cookies on a tray, her head still down. Michael walked closer, stopping just across from her, close enough that she could hear his breath. But she didn't say anything. "When were you planning to tell me?" Sarah blinked slowly, setting the tray down and wiping her hands with a towel. "I was going to tell you after the party. Emily doesn't really do well with all the noise, so I told her to go outside for a while." "Outside?" "She's playing with the dogs in the backyard. They help her feel calmer. And sometimes kids just need their own space." Michael nodded, but his gaze didn't stay on Sarah. It drifted past her through the tiled floor across the small backyard where he once set up a hammock and read fairy tales to his daughter during leave. He turned and walked straight to the back door. Sarah called out behind him, "Michael, don't turn this into something big. We have guests." No one stopped him. No one followed. On the back step, Michael sat down and slowly unzipped his old backpack. Inside were Emily's handkerchief, a small doll he once bought her in Stanton, and a few letters she wrote but never sent. He pulled out the first letter. The childish handwriting wobbled across the page. "Daddy, I still remember the smell of your shoulder when you hugged me. Think if I'd been better, maybe you would have stayed." A breeze caught the edge of the paper, making it flutter slightly. It wasn't the wind of nature, but something else from behind the house, from the place where a dog barked. Not loudly, not angrily, just a lone sound from something that hadn't yet found words. And then faint, but unmistakable, came a voice. "Daddy." He didn't stand up right away, but his eyes changed. He no longer saw things like a soldier returning home, but like a father coming face to face with his deepest fear, that his child had started to see him as someone who abandoned her. On that step, for the first time since leaving his post, Michael realized he had to fight not against an enemy, but against the silence inside a house he once called home. Sarah took a slight step back when Michael stopped in front of her. His eyes held no questions, no words, just a silence thick enough to make breathing difficult for the one standing before him. "I didn't expect you to come back today," she said with a strained laugh. "I haven't even had time to book you a haircut yet." Michael raised his hand and set the old backpack down on the floor. He said nothing, didn't smile. "Don't look at me like that." Sarah blinked, glancing toward the far end of the table. "We're just having a small get-together. Old friends, some relatives. Everyone wanted to know how you were doing." Michael tilted his head slightly, his voice low and steady. "Where's Emily?" Sarah pressed her lips together, one hand clutching the hem of her dress. "She's probably out back. She likes playing with the dogs, remember?" Michael didn't answer. He walked straight toward the hallway that led to the back door, his footsteps slow but firm, like the way he used to patrol borderlines in the dark. Sarah hurried after him, her voice lowering, tightening in her throat. "I was going to surprise you. I thought after the party the three of us could have dinner together. Emily's been a little stubborn lately, so I let her play out back for a bit so things would stay quiet. Michael turned, not frowning, not raising his voice. I taught my dogs to guard this house. What about the people? Sarah didn't answer. Her hand lifted, then dropped again. He pushed the door open. The backyard felt like it was being squeezed by old brick and thick silence. No laughter, no voices, just the soft thud of his boots against the ground, each step falling like a memory. The dog kennel sat in the corner. The metal fencing was rusted, the hinges bent, and in the middle of the stained concrete floor lay a little girl curled up beneath a frayed blanket. She wasn't asleep. Emily opened her eyes when her father's shadow fell across her. She didn't flinch. She wasn't surprised. There was only a brief flicker of recognition and a silent gaze, as if she had grown used to people walking by without ever stopping. Michael sat down next to the door of the kennel. His eyes met his daughter's like they were pressing against a sheet of fragile glass. From inside, Emily spoke. "Daddy, did I do something wrong?" He said nothing, then nodded gently. "You didn't do anything wrong." Emily pushed herself up on one hand and pulled the blanket over her knees. Her breath was soft. "Mom said I should stay here so I wouldn't bother the guests." Michael unlocked the latch, pulled the wire back, and stepped inside. He lifted Emily into his arms, fitting perfectly as she had the first time he carried her out of daycare. Her arms wrapped around his neck, but her other hand still clutched something tightly. Michael didn't look. He didn't ask. It was a crumpled, damp piece of paper likely kept in her pocket for days. He simply held Emily closer to his chest, not to shield her, but to feel her. Her small frame made him conscious of every breath. "Are you cold?" Emily nodded. "I'm sorry." Just 3 words, but they struck something in Michael's chest like an old stitch being pulled from a wound that had never closed. He carried her down the hallway without looking back at Sarah, who stood frozen behind them. Emily's voice came quietly, almost like a confession, as they neared the back door. "Daddy Chispa used to lie next to me. When I was sad, he would rest his head on my arm." Michael looked down at her. "Chispa's the white dog with the black spot on his right eye." "Right," Emily nodded. "You remember the day I brought him home?" "I remember. Then today, I'm bringing you home." Sarah didn't say a word. She didn't move closer either. She stood near the doorframe, gripping an unlit candle in her hand. Her eyes stared blankly as if she had just forgotten something important behind her. A guest sitting at one of the inside tables looked over and quietly set down his glass of wine. No one said anything. No one came closer. But no one turned away either. Michael carried Emily into the living room. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask anyone anything, didn't accuse. He simply walked straight to the chair by the window, sat down, and placed his daughter on his lap. Emily didn't say another word. She just pressed her face into her father's chest. The old blanket was still wrapped around her body, and her hand was still clutching the folded piece of paper inside her small palm. Another little girl from the group of children ran by, paused to look at Emily, then kept running. No one asked why Emily was wearing pajamas at a formal evening gathering. No one asked why she looked so thin. Sarah walked past the couch, picked up a silk scarf that had fallen. "You're making a big deal out of this." Michael looked up, his eyes calm but unwavering. "I'm not doing anything. I just came to the place I belong." Sarah bit her lip. "People are watching." He stroked his daughter's hair, his voice low and steady. "That's because they're not used to the truth." Emily tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered, as if afraid her words might break the fragile silence in the room. "Dad, I found this paper under the kennel floor. "It has writing on it." Michael nodded. He didn't open it, didn't need to read it. "I know, can you read it to me?" Emily lowered her head. She unfolded the small creased piece of paper, her tiny hands trembling. The faint ink and uneven handwriting held the last remaining words of her little world. "I can't read all of it, but it says, 'Even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will take me in.'" Michael lowered his face and touched his forehead to hers. "God won't have to do that, because I'm not leaving you." There was no applause. No one stood up. Only gazes remained, eyes that no longer turned away, no longer pretended, no longer avoided the truth. Sarah turned her face to the side. Trevor came out from the kitchen holding a glass of water. He tried to make a joke. "Emotions are running high. I guess every party needs a good heartfelt speech." Michael stood up. He lifted his daughter into his arms once more, then turned to face the room. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for every single person to hear each word. Everyone saw it, but no one stopped. Michael stepped through the doorway as if crossing an invisible line between two worlds. One was the silent wall of deception. The other was his own heart trembling with a mix of fury and grief. Emily still rested in his arms, her head leaning on his shoulder, eyes wide open but no longer confused. She was listening, absorbing every voice, every glance, and she knew this time her father had seen. No one spoke right away. The soft hum of classical music still drifted from the speakers. Some guests lowered their eyes to their plates. Others glanced at each other and quietly slid their chairs back. No one stood. No one stepped forward. The air stretched tight like a thread waiting to snap from the slightest sound. A middle-aged woman near the buffet table leaned in to whisper to someone beside her loud enough for Michael to hear. "I heard the girl was sent to live with her grandmother." He looked straight at Sarah, who had just stepped out of the kitchen carrying 2 glasses of wine. Her heels paused for a brief second, but then she kept walking, setting the tray down on the table, and smiled as if greeting an old acquaintance she hadn't expected. "Is that Emily? She's always overreacting. Last night she wanted to sleep with the dogs again, probably just sulking over something." Michael didn't argue. He simply bent down and gently lifted the edge of the coat draped over Emily, as if uncovering a shame that didn't belong to her. Her small ankle was caked with dried mud. Scratches had already begun to heal but left a long red mark along the side of her foot. Her fingernails were chipped and packed with dirt, as if she'd been digging desperately for something. Her left knee was slightly swollen, a bruise spreading across her pale, cold skin. A nearby woman covered her mouth and took a step back, her eyes darting. A little boy passing by froze, then whispered to his mother in a mix of curiosity and fear. "Mom, why does that girl look like she just crawled out of the ground?" Trevor Monroe, who had kept a cold, detached demeanor throughout the evening, stepped forward. He was wearing a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hair slicked neatly with gel. His eyes briefly swept across Michael and stopped on Emily. "Michael, maybe you're blowing this out of proportion. Kids fall, get dirty, it's nothing unusual, just part of how they play." Michael didn't look at Trevor. He lowered Emily onto the sofa, carefully pulling the blanket back over her. Emily said nothing, but her eyes stayed open, watching. He straightened up and faced Trevor. His voice was calm, but each word landed with the sharpness of a blade. "What kind of game makes a child sleep in a dog cage?" Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shuffled back. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between the 2 men. "Everyone here just wants a warm, peaceful evening. Please don't turn this into a stage for airing personal matters." Michael turned to her for the first time since he stepped into the house. His eyes weren't angry, just hollow. "Do you know what people here really think about Emily? That she was sent away for a break? Or that you used some vague illness as an excuse so no one would ask? Or maybe that you just left her out there with the dogs because she was in your way?" Sarah glanced around the room. A few stares landed on her. The forced smile on her lips began to fade. "Michael, don't make a scene. Every family has things they can't talk about. We're adults. We should know how to keep our dignity." He stepped closer, but his voice remained calm. "There are some things that if you hide them become sins. And there are children who, if they're not protected, will learn to stay silent forever." The room was silent. A knife clinked against a plate. Someone sighed, someone whispered, but no one said anything to stop him. Michael turned to Trevor. His gaze no longer held warning. It was a verdict. "I want you out of my house, today." Trevor blinked. "I live here with Sarah. This isn't as simple as you think." "I'm not thinking. I just know one thing. Anyone who lives with someone who lets a child suffer like that, no matter how clean they look, is filthy." Emily pulled the blanket up to her chest. Her eyes didn't blink. A single drop fell onto her hand. It wasn't clear whether it came from Michael's sweat or her own tears, but he didn't wipe it away. Sarah said nothing more. She stepped back, gripping her wine glass tightly. One by one, the guests began to leave. Their footsteps echoed like a string of whispers no one dared say aloud. Michael sat beside Emily and placed his hand on her shoulder. No one needed to say anything else. Sometimes courage isn't about shouting in front of a crowd. It's about standing still and letting the truth speak for itself. He looked at his daughter's hand and gently held it. His voice was hoarse but clear. "Are you cold?" Emily gave a small nod. She didn't smile. She didn't snuggle into him like she used to. She just stared at the ceiling. Michael recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had once been lost in the middle of a battlefield with no map back. He knelt in front of her and wrapped his coat around her carefully. A moment later, he stood up and walked over to the dining table where Sarah's wine glass still sat with the smudge of lipstick on the rim. He picked it up, didn't drink, and placed it in front of Trevor. "I don't want anyone around Emily except those who truly care. If that's not you, then you know what to do." No one stood up for Sarah. No one told Trevor to stay. Only the last few guests turned quietly toward the door without a single goodbye. An older man paused as he passed Michael. He spoke softly. "Not everyone has the courage to speak up, but once someone starts, silence begins to shake." Michael nodded. In his mind echoed the quiet sigh of all the years he never had rest. But his hand held firmly to his daughter's shoulder. Emily leaned into him for the first time since he carried her out. The soldier he once was now only needed to guard a little house where his daughter didn't have to tremble when night came. Outside, the wind had stopped howling, but inside Michael, a new door had only just begun to open. The sound of the spoon hitting the side of the pot repeated like a knock inside Michael's mind, soft but impossible to ignore. He stood by the stove not to cook, but as if he were counting his own breaths, trying to keep himself from breaking after a day that had pushed him past every limit. The steam rose steadily, fogging up his glasses, and when he wiped them with the hem of his shirt, he caught sight of his daughter's face in restless sleep beside him. Emily had tilted her head into her thin arm, her breath uneven as if clinging to sleep in the face of strange echoes. Her small legs curled up, not from cold, but like a built-in defense. The wooden chair creaked beneath her, old and worn, and even its silence couldn't hide the faint bruises on her wrists. Michael bent down, looking at her in a stillness so heavy it thickened the air. He didn't reach out. He simply breathed in deeply, catching the scent of a child's sweat mingled with dust and time. It was the scent of a little girl who had learned to fold herself smaller whenever the world felt too big. The kitchen door had never been fixed after the last round of home repairs. It squeaked with every gust of wind, but this time it didn't move. What stirred him now was two firm knocks, short, deliberate. Michael didn't rush. He gently placed a light blanket over Emily's shoulders, then stepped out onto the porch. Mrs. Margaret Collins stood there, eyes dim behind thick glasses, holding a basket covered in white lace. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "Maybe it's this old heart of mine, or maybe my conscience wouldn't let me." Michael opened the door wider, not smiling, just reaching for the basket without looking inside. "Thank you. Your cornbread has never let me down." "It's not cornbread today. It's a confession." He looked up. Her eyes didn't waver, but her hands did. "What is it?" "Something I should have said a long time ago, but old folks, we tend to think silence is safer. I saw Emily in that dog kennel over a week ago, once in the middle of the day, once just before it rained. It wasn't an accident. It was a habit, a pattern." Michael pressed his lips together. He didn't speak. His silence wasn't from a lack of words, but because right now words had less value than listening. Mrs. Collins reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an old phone. "I recorded a few clips, at first just in case anyone asked for proof, but then I couldn't bring myself to show anyone. I knew they'd say I was meddling, sticking my nose in someone else's home, and I got scared." He took the phone. The screen was cracked in one corner, the back held together with tape. She stepped back slightly, as if afraid she'd crossed a line. Michael looked at her, then asked gently, "Did you ever see anyone actually hurt her?" "Not clearly, but I heard things. Sounds no child should make, shouts that went beyond scolding into screaming. Once I heard her whispering to herself. I couldn't make out the words, but one night I opened my window and saw her standing in the rain, not crying, not calling, just standing there, like she was trying to disappear." Michael turned back inside. His steps were slow, but his breathing no longer steady. Emily was still asleep, her small hand gripping the drawstring of his jacket like a makeshift pillow. He turned on the phone and opened the first audio file. There was wind, breathing, then a child's voice. "I shouldn't cry. If I cry, they'll make me leave." Another clip. "I'm a good dog. I won't bark. I won't bite." And the final one, just quiet sobs interrupted by a choked whisper. "It would be nice if I could turn invisible." Michael sat down next to Emily. He gently kissed the top of her head. Placing his hand on her back wasn't just to comfort her, but to steady himself. He didn't know what hurt more, the fact that she had been treated that way, or the fact that she had accepted it as something normal. "You're not a shadow, and I won't let anyone treat you like one." Emily was still drifting in and out of sleep, her small body leaning slightly toward Michael, as if his warmth was the only thing she trusted. Her tiny arm brushed against his shirt, and her head sank deeper into his chest. Michael looked up and met the silent gaze of Mrs. Margaret Collins. She was still there, unmoving, saying nothing more, but the eyes behind her thick glasses quietly lit up like a candle in the middle of a silent prayer. It wasn't just witnessing, it was an unspoken admission. She knew. And now she stood with him. "Could you send me those recordings?" Mrs. Collins replied softly. "I'll have my grandson back them up. I can send them to you by the morning after tomorrow. If you need a printed copy, I can get that too. And if you need me to sign a statement, I'll do it. No fear is greater than watching a child learn to endure pain as if it's normal." Michael nodded. "Thank you. Not just for coming, but for deciding not to stay silent." She turned to leave, but paused at the top step. Without looking back, her voice floated clearly through the stillness. "You know, grown-ups, when we're tired, we choose silence. But children think that if no one hears them, it must be their fault. Don't let her grow up believing that." Michael remained where he was, as if his feet had rooted into the cold tile beneath him. Behind him, the kitchen still carried the faint smell of cooling porridge, mixing with a silence so heavy it pressed against his lungs. Ahead, the dim light from the porch stretched down the steps, casting a quiet glow on Mrs. Collins as she slowly walked away. Each step didn't just cross the small courtyard, it carried with it a piece of memory that had just been stirred away in the middle of the night. He didn't call out. He didn't try to stop her. But his eyes followed her all the way until her silhouette faded into the corner of the street. He stepped back inside and set the phone next to the glass of water on the table. Emily was still curled up, but her face looked calmer now. He didn't say it out loud, but something had already been carved deep in his heart from this moment on. No one was allowed to harm that little girl. No one had the right to make her feel unwanted. It wasn't a vow. It was the most primal instinct of a father who had seen the world collapse and now had only one thing left to protect the wholeness of his daughter. No child should ever have to learn how to endure, and no child should ever believe they have to do it alone. That morning's breakfast had no rising steam, no laughter, and no soothing aroma. Everything was in its proper place, yet it lacked a soul. The worn wooden chairs looked as if they had grown used to supporting weary backs rather than welcoming people who truly wanted to sit. On the table, the freshly poured kettle was still hot, but that warmth didn't seem to reach the space between the three people trying not to meet each other's eyes. In the living room, the old television played on mute, showing flickering images that filled the silence like someone afraid to hear their own thoughts. Trevor Monroe sat cross-legged reading the newspaper. The folded paper floated between his hands like a legal mask. His coffee had long gone cold, untouched, as if it existed solely to justify his presence. Sarah Monroe sat across from him, carefully placing each porcelain plate on the table. Her hand lightly brushed the rim of a glass, adjusting a crooked spoon in front of Trevor. Beneath these seemingly harmless gestures was a tension masked by mechanical politeness. Mornings like this weren't rare in this house, where the same roles were replayed day after day, and only the children couldn't understand why grown-ups stayed so quiet in a space that smelled of coffee and denial. Michael Reese walked into the kitchen without being invited, and no one stopped him. He no longer wore his uniform, but his silence was enough to tighten the room's atmosphere by a notch. He opened the lid of the coffee pot, poured himself half a cup, then sat down next to Emily, who was quietly coloring in the corner of the table. She didn't look up, but her hand paused for a brief second before continuing her strokes, slow and deliberate. Sarah broke the silence with an even-toned voice. "You're up early. I guess you slept well last night." Michael didn't answer. He gently blew over the surface of the coffee, his eyes fixed on the table. She went on with a faint half-smile. "If you're still tense about the other day, I think we should clear things up. I never meant to do anything that would hurt her. It's just that sometimes kids need boundaries." Michael set the cup down not forcefully, but with just enough sound for the clink to cut through the artificial calm. She used to panic around fire. And you let her stay near the dog kennel. Did anyone in this house even notice that Trevor folded the newspaper, his voice low and measured? Michael, you're talking like someone did it on purpose. Everybody slips up now and then. I'm not talking about carelessness, Trevor. I'm talking about repetition. There have been too many so-called coincidences in this house. Sarah let out a laugh, but it was dry, brittle, like leaves falling outside the porch. I raised her, fed her, took her to the doctor, handled every school uniform while you were off somewhere between forests and borders. One incident happens and you act like I'm on trial. Is that fair? Trevor glanced at Sarah, then at Michael. There was no anger in his eyes, only calculation. Trevor's presence in this house had never been simple. He was Sarah's cousin on her mother's side, a man who had once failed in a real estate venture and then suddenly moved in under the guise of being a temporary guest only to never leave. Michael looked over at Emily. The girl was still coloring her hand steady, though the crayon strokes drifted outside the edge of the daisy's outline. He didn't answer Sarah. Instead, he leaned in gently toward his daughter. What did you draw yesterday? Emily looked up. Her gaze wasn't fearful, nor was it close. It carried a calm, distant quality that was hard to name. I drew a door. Inside was my room. Outside there was a stone bench and a lemon tree, but the door didn't have a lock anymore. Trevor raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a pretty positive image. Michael nodded slightly. Because from now on she understands that the space around her isn't an invisible wall anymore. She has the right to open the door and step out whenever she wants without fearing that someone's going to shut it behind her. Sarah stood up and began collecting the dishes. She didn't look at anyone. If you want to raise her with a boot camp mentality, I won't stop you. But don't impose your rigid mindset on this family. This is a home, not a training ground. Michael took his eyes off the coffee cup and looked directly at Sarah for the first time. And because this is a home, I won't let anyone treat my daughter like a pet. The air thickened. Trevor set the newspaper aside and muttered, "Blowing this up won't help anyone. If it's going to get ugly, maybe we should meet somewhere more formal." Michael gave a laugh, silent but clear. I was thinking the same thing. I imagine a lawyer would appreciate hearing this more than I would. Sarah turned sharply, ready to respond, but before she could get a word out, Emily stood up. She pressed the drawing against her chest, still holding the pencil tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Without saying a word, she walked out of the room. Her steps were as soft as mist settling into sand. When the door closed behind her, there wasn't a sound, only a quiet gap shaped like sorrow. Some children don't need to cry to prove they're hurting. All it takes is for them to stop asking, stop reaching out for hugs, and start leaving rooms with light in them. Once only the adults were left. Trevor walked over to the window and said vaguely, "If you plan on reopening everything, you better be ready for the fallout. No one gets to live peacefully if they keep digging up the past." Michael remained seated, his gaze unsettlingly calm. "I'm not digging up the past. I just don't want my daughter imprisoned in the future you're all building." Sarah grabbed a dish towel and scrubbed the table, her hand gripping the cloth as if trying to hold on to whatever was left. In the world of adults, some confrontations don't need shouting to cause damage. Sometimes it's composure that delivers the sharpest blow. There's a saying among Mexicans, when someone speaks softly and others go silent to hear them, their words weigh heavier than gunfire. The air inside the county recorder's office always carried the scent of old paper and thermal ink. But that morning, Michael Reese didn't pay attention to the smells or the colors. He clutched in his hand the property sale file, a printed copy from 5 years ago. The paper yellowed at the corners, but the signature still crisp, the red ink still sharp. It was the only document he still trusted while everything else around him was slowly slipping into uncertainty. He walked straight up to the intake counter, his gaze steady but unreadable. The young clerk looked up from her computer, pausing a half-finished conversation with a coworker, and nodded when Michael said, "I need to verify the ownership of this property. No pleasantries, no small talk." He handed over the copy of the contract. She took it, entered a few commands into the system, and glanced at the screen waiting for something familiar to appear. But when she saw the result, her brow furrowed slightly. "Can you confirm the address is 147 Hidalgo Street?" Michael gave a small nod. The clerk looked at him, then turned back to the screen. A few seconds passed in silence before she spoke again. Her voice not exactly surprised, but clearly hesitant. "The current deed lists 2 names, Sarah Monroe and Trevor Monroe." Michael didn't move, but something in his eyes darkened. Not anger, not shock, just that fleeting moment when your body realizes a suspicion has become fact, and that fact is cloaked in silence. "I need a copy of the transaction record," Michael said, his hand still resting on the counter. The clerk nodded, switched screens, and began navigating through the system with practiced ease. As the printer started feeding out the first pages, she cast a quick glance his way as if weighing something, then asked in a slightly quieter tone, "Are you sure this signature is yours?" She slid the paper onto the glass counter. Michael leaned down and examined the black ink bearing his name. The handwriting was familiar, yet so strangely cold it felt foreign. The R looped far too long, slanted unnaturally left, and the Reese lacked the small underline he always placed beneath the final E. He didn't answer. He just shook his head slowly. The clerk didn't press further. There was no pity in her expression, only a quiet kind of respect for a man standing in front of paperwork that had betrayed him, yet hadn't lost his composure. Michael walked away from the counter without a word. His hand hung loose at his side, not carrying the copy. As the glass door clicked shut behind him, sunlight slanted through the tree branches outside, stripping away an invisible layer of dust clinging to his thoughts. Each step he took felt like crossing an invisible edge between the life he thought he still had control over and the reality now unraveling beneath him. But he didn't stop walking. There was no explosion inside him, just a slow, steady silence, as if the worst thing wasn't that he had been deceived, but that the deception had been so seamless. Outside, he sat down on a bench by the curb. The breeze drifted across the back of his shirt as if life was reminding him that no matter how long you pause, the world keeps moving. He took out his phone and typed a message to Thomas Reed, an old friend who used to be a JAG lawyer and now lived in Quaker Ridge. "I've got a property deed under someone else's name. Weird signature. Let me know when you're free." Thomas didn't make him wait. The reply came in under 3 minutes. "Do you have a picture of it?" So they'll need to do a handwriting analysis, no way around it. But if Trevor Monroe's involved, be careful. He's been named in at least 3 shady transfers, all involving suspicious power of attorney forms. Michael read the message, eyes fixed on the screen. His heart didn't race, but something in the foundation of his trust began to crack. He didn't reply. He just locked the phone, stood up, adjusted the strap on his backpack, and kept walking. Men who've been through war don't need a lot of reasons to stay silent, because some battles can't be charged into or shouted through. You just wait for the right moment to pull the trigger. When Michael got home, the front door was still open. He stepped inside without making a sound, his eyes scanning the hallway like a stranger observing a place that used to be his home. Sarah was on the phone in the living room. She didn't see him. So what if he came back? He hasn't even said what his plan is. I bet he won't last a month. Guys who've lived on military bases don't do well with crying kids and the smell of fabric softener. Michael stood in the shadows just listening. He didn't interrupt. He walked straight into his old study, now nothing more than a few stacks of papers, a wooden desk with a cracked edge, and the last drawer where he had once hidden Emily's vaccination record. He opened the bottom drawer. The wood scraped against the hinges with a dry, broken sound like an unfinished sigh. He checked each compartment one by one, unhurried, as if retracing pieces of a life that once believed in stability. In the farthest corner, he pulled out a bundle of documents sealed carefully in plastic, the original deed to the house from when he and Sarah first moved in, Emily's birth certificate still marked with fresh blue ink, his old military ID, and a few copies of permits that had once been pinned to a base bulletin board. He didn't arrange them by legal importance, but by memory. He wrapped everything in an old army green canvas pouch, the same one that had followed him through 3 deployments. Now it would hold what was left of a father starting over from a fracture. Emily came down from the loft. Her hair was messy, and she still wore the sleep strap on her wrist. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes curious, as they settled on the backpack slung over her dad's shoulder. "Dad, where are we going?" Michael stood up and zipped the bag shut. He looked at her directly. No hesitation. "We're going to take back what's yours." He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't need to explain. Emily didn't ask again. She just stepped closer to him as if from now on every distance between them would be closed one step at a time. There are documents that may be legal, but never truly just. And there are promises that don't need notarizing because they're written in a glance and signed with the heart. Adults can forge ownership, but a child always knows exactly where they belong. No one ever talks about doors that have stayed shut too long, but every rusted hinge holds a sigh of its own. Michael stood at the school gate, his hand resting gently on Emily's head like a silent promise. The girl said nothing, only tightened her grip on her father's fingers, as if letting go would mean disappearing all over again. Maplewood Elementary was nestled between rows of aging buildings, their paint faded and walls stained with time. The smell of old paper, dried ink, and brittle tree sap still lingered in the air like a scent of history that refused to fade. The bell had just rung, and a few children spilled out, yelling and running around the water fountain. No one noticed the tall man in the worn-out shirt quietly leading a little girl whose shoulders were hunched inward, as if even the wind might bruise her. "Hi, I'm looking for Ms. Rachel. Does she still teach here?" Michael asked when a staff member stepped out of the office, arms full of papers. The woman glanced quickly at the father and daughter, her eyes flicking to the dirt-caked shoes on Michael's feet before settling on Emily. She gave a small nod. "Last room down the left hallway, just past the art room. She only teaches part-time now. Fewer kids these days." Michael nodded reflexively. They made their way down the long hallway, each loose tile beneath their feet giving off a faint squeak under his boots. The ceiling was low, tangled wires drooped overhead, and an old ceiling fan spun in defiance, rattling against the current of time. Emily paused for a moment, lifting her gaze to the student artwork taped along the walls. Her eyes stopped on a half-finished sunflower painting. She didn't ask about it. She just reached out and lightly touched the petal that had been torn. It was such a small detail that Michael hadn't noticed, but Emily stared at it for a long while, as if mending something only she could see. No one hurried them. No one spoke. They kept walking as if every hollow space in their lives was being filled in by the silence they shared. The classroom door creaked open. Ms. Rachel was tucking books into a desk cubby. She turned when she heard footsteps. Her eyes blinked fast when she saw Michael, but when she saw Emily, her hand froze mid-air, still clutching the edge of a book cover. "Michael, is it really you? I need to talk to you," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but every word was clear. Emily stayed behind him, her eyes meeting the teacher's briefly before turning away. I thought Sarah already transferred her. She said she was switching Emily to a new school for health reasons. I had no way of getting in touch after that." Michael didn't reply. He just kept looking at her, an unwavering stare that made Rachel's shoulders draw in. "You know, Emily was pulled out of school suddenly 4 months ago. No withdrawal form, no official reason. I noticed bruises on her arms twice. After the second time, I submitted a report to the principal. I followed all the protocol. But then, the records vanished. Even the report's gone." Michael sat down at a small table nearby. Emily let go of his hand and quietly walked toward the art shelf. The boxes of crayons had broken lids. The paintbrushes were stiff with dried paint, and the drawing paper curled at the edges. She took a sheet, pulled a crayon from an old metal tin, and began to draw. No one stopped her. No one told her to sit down or say hello. She didn't need guidance. This had once been her world before she was pushed out of it. Ms. Rachel poured a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. I used to hear her talking to herself, repeating the same phrase. "I have to be good. I have to stay quiet." No child should say that. But I didn't have the authority to take it any further. Michael opened his backpack and took out a photocopy of the house title transfer. He laid it on the teacher's desk. "Do you recognize this signature?" Rachel glanced at it, then frowned. "I'm not entirely sure. It looks like your name, but the handwriting doesn't match the letters you used to send to Emily." Emily gently placed her drawing on the table, her eyes still watching the unfinished lines. In the picture was a small house with a crooked red tile roof. A tall man was leaning over beside a little girl with long hair tousled by the wind. A dog sat quietly next to them, its gaze fixed on a corner of the yard where the wire kennel had completely lost one of its sides. No door had been forced open, just broken, twisted bars scattered as if something from inside had snapped the chains. The sky in the background shifted from gray to blue with a bit of pale sunlight seeping through the trembling strokes. The drawing was rough, unpolished, but one thing was clear: for the first time, Emily had drawn herself, and she was no longer trapped. Rachel brought her hand to her mouth. She's never drawn people before, only flowers, the sun, and clouds. Today, this might be the first time she's allowed herself to remember. Michael nodded, but his eyes didn't leave his daughter's hands. He slid the drawing into his document folder. "Thank you. I need to head to the notary's office." At the notary on the corner, the fluorescent lights cast a pale glow that washed out everyone's faces. The notary, Mark Hollis, a middle-aged man with thick glasses, accepted Michael's documents with a distracted air. But when he saw the name on the signature, his eyes shifted. "This name, it's familiar. Someone came in with a power of attorney under that name. A man named Trevor Monroe came in with a woman. They presented a document certified by Pastor Daniel Carter." Michael paused for a beat. "Did they follow all the required steps?" Mark nodded slowly. "It seemed like all the paperwork was there. But I remember the woman was in a hurry. Her voice was rushed. Her eyes weren't steady. I still have the digital copy if you want it." "I do," Michael said. "As soon as possible." Mark leaned over the desk, filled out a request slip, and handed it to Michael for signature. "We'll print a copy and email it to you, but if this turns into a legal dispute, you'll want to speak with the authorities." Michael didn't respond. He just stood up and shook the man's hand, a firm, short handshake. Not warm, but clear. Emily was waiting outside. It had just started to drizzle. She held one hand out to catch the raindrops. After a moment, she spoke. "I can make another drawing, but this time the cage won't be there anymore. Can we plant something there, Dad?" Michael looked down at her. He gently brushed back her hair, damp with mist. "Yes, but you'll need to pick something with deep roots. So when it grows up, it can never be pulled out. Some wounds don't need stitches. They just need someone to know they don't have to heal alone. Just like a name erased from a record, but never from the heart of someone who remembers." The murmurs inside the church hadn't fully died out, but outside the sunlight was already spilling across the dust-covered stone benches. People slowly trickled out through the gates, exchanging handshakes and smiles. The shuffle of old women's slippers blended with children's laughter, slow and hollow. The scent of candle wax still lingered, faintly mixed with the trailing smoke of incense, like the fading whisper of a place once considered sacred before schemes and deception were brought all the way to the altar. Michael Reese didn't stand near the entrance. Instead, he kept to the shaded side of a damp stone wall. One arm clutched a worn leather notebook under his arm, while the other hung loosely by his side, his index finger tapping occasionally against the leg of his jeans as if marking time against his own pulse. He didn't hurry to go in. He didn't even look directly toward the pulpit. The sermon still echoed faintly, gentle and warm, like the scent of old incense. Each line pierced softly like a needle threading skin. It didn't draw blood, but it left a mark. When anger rises in your heart, think of forgiveness, not because the other deserves it, but because your soul deserves peace. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, not because he believed, but because he needed to be sure he had really heard those words and not just imagined them. He stepped in just as the final amen faded. The congregation was slowly dispersing. A few elderly folks bowed their heads to the cross. Children were running in circles around the statue of the Virgin Mary, and no one scolded them. Pastor Daniel Carter still stood near the pulpit. A soft, polite smile settled on his face, worn smooth, like something that had been applied too many times. Michael walked straight toward him and stopped when they were one arm's length apart. "I need to speak with you, privately." Detective Carter flinched slightly, but then nodded and motioned for him to follow into the small room behind the church. That room had once been where Michael and his late wife had come to arrange Emily's baptism. But today, the space had taken on a different air, an air of caution, of silences, padded by words carefully chosen to sound reasonable. The pastor poured 2 glasses of water and placed them on the wooden table. Michael didn't sit down. He didn't touch the water either. "I'm not thirsty." Carter sat. His eyes were those of a man past 60, still carrying the kindness polished by years of practice. "So what brings you here, Michael? Is this about God or something more specific?" "Something specific. The affidavit you signed allowing Sarah and her cousin to transfer the deed to the house I bled to earn." Carter rested his arms on the table, his index finger lightly tapping the rim of the glass. "Sarah came to me in distress. She said you'd abandoned the family, left the child behind. I had no reason to doubt her. And you had no reason to verify the truth. No call to me, no letter, not even a question. You signed your name, sealed it, and wore the robe of a savior. Do you realize you helped legalize outright theft?" I was just trying to help a mother in pain. She didn't strike me as someone who would lie." Michael gave a bitter, short laugh. He looked Carter in the eye, not with shouting, not with accusation, but with the quiet intensity of someone who had once stood guard in the darkest hours of night and no longer knew how to forgive. "You believed in a woman's tears more than the signature of a man who once gave his life to this country. You saw a woman in a dark dress speaking softly and assumed she couldn't lie. But you didn't see an 8-year-old girl sleeping in a dog kennel. You didn't see her meals of cold water. You didn't see the bruises under her eyes." Carter remained silent. His eyes dropped, but his hands stayed still on the table. "I heard whispers," he murmured. "But I believe people can change. Sarah, she seemed remorseful." Michael inhaled deeply, then slowly opened the leather notebook under his arm. Between its folded pages, he pulled out a thin, time-worn sheet of paper. The edges were jagged, as if it had once been torn in haste. With deliberate calm, he smoothed it onto the table, pressing his finger gently on the center, where faded violet ink formed a line of slanted handwriting, trembling like someone had written it, trying to hold on to something sacred that was slipping away. "Aunque mi padre y mi madre me abandonen, el Señor me acogerá." Carter's eyes widened. "She wrote that," Michael said, "when she was locked behind metal mesh surrounded by dog waste and fear. That verse you've recited hundreds of times from the pulpit, she wrote it without anyone teaching her. No one taught her, but she believed it. She believed it in a desperate way, like it was the only thing left." Carter picked up the paper. His hand trembled slightly, but his mouth still tried to form a defense. "Sometimes God allows hardship so we can grow stronger." "No, Carter, that wasn't hardship. That was silence. And when a child needs saving, silence is complicity." The room thickened like old dust pressing into the cracks between wood. Carter didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the paper, as if touching it again would force him to admit everything he had chosen not to see. At last, he let out a slow breath and leaned forward. He gently placed the paper back in the center of the table. No words, no nod, no parting glance. Michael reached out, picked it up, folded it carefully like a relic, and tucked it into his shirt pocket, as if safeguarding a truth the other man lacked the courage to hold. "You don't need to apologize. What's lost can't be undone with words. But you need to remember this. You didn't save anyone. Not if you chose to believe appearances over the truth." Michael walked out of the room. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Some doors once closed are meant to stay that way. Pastor Carter remained seated, his hand resting gently on the faint purple imprint left on the table. His lips were pressed tight, not out of regret, but because the truth had arrived too fast, too unrelenting, and all the words he had prepared now seemed pointless. A ceiling fan turned slowly above the conference room, its dry, rattling sound reminding everyone that the silence wasn't peaceful. It was tension held in suspense. The room was wide but not warm. The long glass-covered table reflected scattered papers, flipped through, folded back, pushed forward, each page like a quiet cut into something no one wanted to remember. Michael Reese sat at one end of the table. His posture was steady, neither bowed nor defiant. He sat like someone who had grown used to waiting, someone who had stood watch 1,000 nights along the border and was now simply standing another post, this time for his daughter. Emily sat beside him, her small hand clutching the frayed hem of his old jacket. Her back was straight, but her eyes were cast down. She didn't lean into her father, but she didn't drift away either. At the other end of the table, Sarah Monroe was perfectly styled, her outfit crisp, without a single wrinkle, a silver cross necklace glinting at her throat. She leaned slightly forward as if bracing herself against some invisible chill. Her attorney, a gray-faced man with a voice as dry as dust, was the first to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client firmly asserts that the accusations brought against her are unfounded." Mr. Michael Reese returned after a long and unexplained absence and immediately demanded both property rights and custody of the child. Such behavior raises questions and could be interpreted as a misuse of parental authority. Lauren Pierce, the representative from Child Protection Services, lifted her head slowly from the file in front of her, as if surfacing from a long, heavy memory. Her eyes swept the room, not stopping on anyone in particular, but giving each person the sense they'd been seen. She gave a quiet nod, as if brushing off the weight of old cases, years of forgotten children buried in paperwork no one dared read to the last line. Michael sat unmoving, calm, as if waiting for a full breath rather than a moment to strike. He reached down and unzipped the worn canvas bag that had traveled with him since his military years. The zipper made a soft sound like an old door opening, slow but certain. He pulled out a file, thick and neatly clipped, its edges curled from being read and reread, handled by hands that never gave up. "I'd like to submit the documents I've verified through proper legal channels." His voice was steady, each word honed by years of silence. First, he laid out the original home purchase agreement bearing his signature. Then he followed it with a revised document flagged by a notary public as containing forged elements. The next item was a voice recording from Mrs. Margaret Collins, the elderly neighbor, capturing Sarah berating Emily and ordering the girl to be locked in the dog kennel for embarrassing the adults. Then came a handwritten affidavit from Rachel Monroe, Emily's former teacher, stating the child had been pulled from school without explanation, and that all medical and academic records were abruptly withdrawn after Sarah submitted a falsified transfer request. Finally, he presented a health report from the local clinic documenting signs of malnutrition and older injuries to Emily's ankle and back. No one in the room spoke. The murmurs had died. Every eye turned toward Emily, not with pity, but with a quiet shame for having once looked away. Lauren Pierce removed her glasses and placed them on the table. Her gaze landed gently on the little girl. "Emily, sweetheart, you can say anything you want. This is a safe place. No one will pressure you." Emily blinked, still holding her father's jacket. Then slowly she stood. She stepped into the center of the room with a small but steady posture. No one prompted her. Everyone simply waited. "I'm not afraid when I'm with Dad. With him I get warm meals, not cold soup from the night before. I don't have to sleep with dogs. I'm allowed to talk. I don't have to stay quiet just because there are guests." The girl's voice was small but steady, each sentence slicing through the falsehoods that had coated the very place that should have kept her safe. An elderly woman seated in the back row bowed her head slightly, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear that had just spilled from the corner of her eye. Sarah's attorney, who had just started to jot something in his leather notebook, froze midway, then slowly closed it, as if anything else he wrote now would be meaningless. Sarah turned toward the window, her eyes vacant, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned a pale, grayish white. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, but she forced herself to stay composed in front of everyone. Ms. Pierce looked over at Detective Dawson. He gave a subtle nod. A staff member stepped forward and whispered something in her ear. Then she turned back and for the first time leaned slightly toward Michael. "We've just received a report from Oakland International Airport Police. Mr. Trevor Monroe, the individual listed as co-owner of the contested property, has been taken into custody. His luggage contained numerous forged documents related to real estate, medical records, and custody rights. Sarah went pale. No one stepped forward to defend her. Not because they didn't want to, but because the truth had now stripped away any right to doubt. Michael didn't say a word. He simply placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. Ms. Pierce flipped to the final page of the case file and signed a document swiftly. Based on Section 32B of the Child Protection Act and all evidence presented, we officially recommend the court restore full custody rights to Mr. Michael Reese. No one applauded. There were no sighs of relief. There was only the quiet way Emily turned, wrapped her arms around her father's neck, and rested her head on his shoulder gently, without crying, without speaking, as if she had finally returned to the one place every child deserves to belong. Ms. Pierce said to Detective Dawson, "Write up the report and finalize the paperwork now. I'll sign it immediately." The detective nodded, his eyes settling on Michael. He didn't offer congratulations. He didn't say thank you. He simply placed a hand on the father's shoulder and said, "Some people never speak up, but they also never back down." A life reclaimed is not meant to be admired. It's meant so a father can look into his daughter's eyes and say, not with words, but by simply being there, "I never left you." People often think peace comes from silence, but in truth, it only arrives when the heart stops worrying about the things it can't control and starts caring for the small things it can hold right now. A fine layer of dust coated the edge of the window frame. Michael tilted his head and carefully wiped each corner clean, then set the photograph back in place, nestled between two faded pink ribbons. In the picture, his wife Laura was holding Emily when she was just a few months old, both of their eyes shining as if they had just finished laughing. The small bedroom carried a different kind of warmth now. Michael closed the window and drew the curtains. Chispa lay with her chin resting on Emily's heel, her tail flicking softly every time the little girl tiptoed across the room to tape up another strip of paper. She didn't ask her father for permission. She didn't ask about the wall's measurements. Each ribbon of color went up as naturally as Emily's own thoughts, spontaneous, full of color, and with no order at all. Michael watched his daughter without interrupting. Since they moved back in, he had let Emily choose the curtains, the paint, even how to rearrange the bed. Something in her eyes had changed since the day he carried her out of the dog kennel. It wasn't complete peace, not yet, but at least she no longer flinched at the light. "Should we plant flowers or chili peppers?" Emily asked as they stood in front of the old kennel. Michael squinted, then quietly bent down and picked up an old pair of pliers from the wooden toolbox. The same fingers that had once gripped a rifle now clutched the worn metal handle. One by one, the rusted links came undone with dry creaks, as if the cage itself was exhaling its final breath. Emily sat beside him, holding a tiny brush, patiently brushing away the layers of dirt clinging to the kennel's base, like she was performing a quiet ritual to erase something best left forgotten. Flowers make people smile easily, but they fall easily too. Peppers, even the small ones, can make a whole pot of soup unforgettable, Michael said with a soft smile, setting the pliers aside. "If this soil belongs to you, then you get to plant anything you want, even dreams and memories." Emily paused, then nodded. "Then I want to plant both. Pretty to look at, spicy to remember." The last light of the day filtered through the leaves, scattering golden flecks across the sandy ground. Michael propped one end of the hoe into the earth and sat for a breath, then began turning over handfuls of moist soil again. Emily bent down and gently pressed each seed into the soft dirt, her small hands moving with care as she watched every motion her father made like she was learning how to sow hope. Chispa ran in circles, then suddenly stopped and began scratching a shallow hole in the soil with her front paws, as if she too wanted to bury something of her own in this newly reborn yard. A sharp knock echoed from the iron gate, firm enough to make all three of them turn at once. Michael laid down the hoe, brushed the dirt from his hands, and slowly walked toward the gate. The iron creaked open, revealing a familiar figure, Detective Eric Dawson, holding a worn brown canvas bag that had accompanied him through many tense days of investigation. "I don't drink coffee," he said quickly, taking off his sunglasses. "Just stopped by to drop off a few documents." Emily ran behind Michael, leaning gently against him. "She's still shy around me, huh?" "I'm not shy," Emily whispered. "It's just, you always bring files. Files make people nervous." Detective Dawson chuckled and pulled out a thin envelope. "Not scary files this time. It's her school admission notice and a spot in an art class." He bent down and looked at her. "Someone wants you to learn what you love. They didn't leave a name, but I'm sure they care about you very much." Emily took the envelope and held it tightly like she was afraid it might fly away. Michael glanced at the logo on the sponsorship form and recognized the stamp from a unit he had once served in. He didn't say anything, just nodded in quiet gratitude. Dawson gave Michael a light pat on the shoulder. "Maybe I should start growing vegetables like you. At least veggies don't come with lawsuits." As the sun touched the edge of the roof tiles, Mrs. Margaret Collins appeared at the back gate with a bundle of warm empanadas wrapped in hand-embroidered cloth. Unlike usual, she didn't hesitate to call out in a loud voice that echoed across the yard, "Michael, are you home, son?" He rushed over. Mrs. Collins looked at him, her eyes twinkling in the sunlight. "Michael, dear," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The pastries are still warm. Eat them with your little girl. Make her smile. And hey, Emily is welcome at my house anytime she likes. Just remind her to knock first. This old heart of mine can't handle jump scares anymore." Michael tilted his head slightly and opened the wooden door wide, letting the light spill diagonally across the threshold. He didn't say a word, but his eyes softened as if a long-carried burden had finally been lifted. Hearing Mrs. Collins' voice, Emily rushed out from the kitchen and wrapped both arms around her. The flour-stained apron still clung to her cheeks like the sweet mark of a childhood just beginning to bloom again. Night fell after the simple, warm meal. Emily carried a small picture frame to her room, opened the drawer, and pulled out a weathered slip of paper, laminated in plastic, the Bible verse she had found while locked outside in the yard. "Can I hang this here?" she asked. Michael stood behind her and nodded. "Wherever you feel the most at peace, that's the best place to keep what matters most." Emily hung the frame just above her desk. Under the soft yellow light, the faded ink still held its shape. Michael placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "If one day I don't make it back in time, remember you'll always have a place to stay." Emily turned, wrapped her arms around his neck, and rested her head on his shoulder. "Like how the dog kennel doesn't have a lock anymore." Michael smiled, not brightly, but deeply enough to feel the weight ease from a long, heavy journey. "What once kept you caged is gone," he whispered. "Now there's only a home for you to grow up in." Some wounds don't appear on the skin. They live deep inside the eyes of a child. But in those eyes, when met with someone who truly sees like Michael, hurt is no longer a scar. It becomes the starting point of healing. Michael didn't shout, didn't slam tables, didn't use power to fight for justice. He simply did one thing, simple yet profound. He stood beside his child, cleared every trace of pain, and showed Emily that the place that once caged her had become a garden. It wasn't just the act of a father, it was the voice of compassion rising against injustice. Sarah and Trevor, who once hid the truth behind documents and titles, who thought paperwork could mask a guilty conscience, were finally brought into the light, because justice doesn't always come early, but it always comes on time. And goodness, if held long enough, will always be rewarded with new life, like how Emily now gets to learn to paint, to plant flowers, and to simply be a child again. What do you think of Michael as a father? Have you ever seen a case like Emily's in real life? If one day you knew a child was being hurt and no one else was speaking up, would you have the courage to be the first to rise? Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you're going through something that's left you feeling tired or heavy, remember, just like Emily, everyone deserves a place to come home to. Are you doing okay? I'm always wishing you something kind and good.